Hey everyone. Before we get started, I just wanted to find out if anybody had any questions as to how the rest of this week's going to go, how the rest of the year's going to run. So if you have questions, just remember unmute yourself, ask, remute yourself so that we don't hear the weird echo. But I do want to make sure if we have questions, we were able to ask live. I will tell you that other than going into any old no reassignments, I did get through all of any new emails that came through over the weekend. I did check on the arithmetic and geometric mean series sequence quiz. I got all of those in. So I'm just trying to make sure that we tackle today live for those questions. So at any point in time that you have a question, please ask. I know on Friday, and I can't even remember now, but on Friday I had suggested that you could go ahead and watch the honors geometry stuff and the regular geometry information from last week. I am going to suggest that if you do need any extra help, those are probably the best resources right now, because that's what I'm introducing for the first time to them. Just to make sure everybody can hear me, yes?
Yes.
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 I can't hear you. That stinks. Why can't I hear you? Oh, well. In the chat, can you guys just give me a thumbs up if, or in the, are you guys able to hear me or no? Okay, so you guys can hear me. I don't know why I can't hear you. That's crazy. Well, that stinks. All right, so like I said, throughout this week, we are going to continue with our Chapter 12 information from our book. Again, if any assignments that I do give this week will be minimal required. You will, however, have one quiz that I will give similar to the other two, where it will be a Google quiz. I think that seems to be what people, at least results-wise, look more comfortable. Please understand that when I give that, that will be the last graded assignment. And I've received a couple emails, and I don't remember if I put it into your stream, but please remember that no new assignments are being given after May 22nd. That does not mean school is over. So what that means is any assignments that you still need to do, what we'll do is we will run class where it will be a question and answer period for the first, give or take, 15, 20 minutes, depending upon how long it takes. If you have no questions, then what I will do is, so that you are prepared for next year, I will continue with this chapter to make sure that you have as much material going into next year as possible. The only difference is nothing will be a required assignment, so there won't be any grades coming in for that. That doesn't mean I won't provide you with practice problems so that if you wish to try them, you have something to do. So just keep that in mind. Nothing new after May 22nd, but I will still be continuing through the end of the year, allowing you to send me emails with any questions from any past assignments. I know that I've had one or two that didn't get to the first quiz, and I was able to take screenshots of that and send that to people. I haven't received any back yet, but I did provide those. So we will do every week after this week as a question and answer, and then I will introduce a little bit of material every class day so that we are getting ready for pre-calc next year. So if I know, and I know you guys are all just words on a screen, but I do know that in your drop down, you should have a way to give me a thumbs up or raise your hand or something. Sorry, apparently our streets all flooded the other day, and I have a feeling that's the street cleaner. I hope you guys can still hear me okay. I have the windows open. And I just got rid of a plumber because everything backed up. So it's been a wonderful morning. Okay, so I don't know why I can't hear you guys. That kind of upsets me. So I'm going to get started. Today we are going to just go over how to do sides, how to find sides, how to find angles, and then we will talk about angles of elevation and depression. So all of this we talked about last year in honors geometry or geometry. So the first we're going to look at is how to find sides. If you recall, in any of our examples, when we're finding side lengths, you will have an angle measure, and it doesn't matter what that angle measure is. So at times there was special right triangles that we dealt with, where they were 30, 60, 90, 45, 45, 90. Where we had to rely on trig was where those angles weren't falling into any of those categories. And then let's go ahead and just make that opposite side 14. And a little bit of review from geometry. Just make sure that you remember without the bar over the top means that we're finding the length of the side. So what ends up happening is if you looked at any of my notes from the geometry class, or if you remember from last year, I always circle the reference angle so that we know which one we're using. And then in reference to the 23-degree angle, this side is opposite. Then we have adjacent, and then our hypotenuse we know is always opposite the right angle. And what I can't forget is that every one of our choices isn't just made up. So what I did was, especially with the geometry class, they were having a very hard time figuring out which one to choose. So I wrote out the definitions, and then I also made sure that they understood that when we look at SOHCAHTOA as a mnemonic device, if it's grouped, that's the one I have to pick. So when I look at trying to find AC, I'm going to look at the fact that ACs are hypotenuse. The only other given value is opposite. So when I'm looking at these definitions, more like equations, equal sign equation, I want to be able to fill in all the missing pieces. The angle measure, which is theta, the value for the opposite side, the value for the hypotenuse. And remember, sine is an actual function. So it's telling us what to do. So when we have to solve an equation, we really only want one unknown so that we can solve. So if I'm looking to find AC and I have opposite and hypotenuse, that's why we chose sine. The unknown for the angle is actually 23. Our definition of opposite over hypotenuse, oops. So what we end up with is only one unknown, and that's AC. make sure, and this is where this year we are going to go further, and again, unfortunately, no required work, but when you do get to your calculator down here, we talked last year about being able to change things with degree. So if your calculator isn't in degree mode, you have to make sure that it's underlined. If not, you have radian measure and then gradian measure, which we'll never use. But radians we're going to actually use this year. So that's where we have to be careful if we're in degree or radian. So make sure right now degree is underlined, push enter, and then that'll at least get you where you want to be. Don't forget that we have sine. We're going to plug in 23, enter, and remember that this is actually a ratio in decimal form. So I write down just a few to keep track of, but I'm not going to get rid of it in my calculator. And I set it up this way so that what I'm actually doing is solving a proportion. And we're going to be able to cross multiply and solve. So with this one, our 0.3907 is times AC, 1 times 14. To solve for AC, we're going to divide. So because I left it here on my calculator, 14 divided by second answer, and we end up with the length of the side for our hypotenuse is 35.83. And it's an approximate, but it is going to round, and we're going to round it to the nearest hundredth unless otherwise told. So opposite the right angle should be our longest side. So 35 feels like it's much longer than 14, so it makes sense. Now, I will tell you, for those of us that like to do a lot on our calculator and not write a lot down, at least this calculator, you can do 14 divided by sine 23, and it should give you the same value. So that's just something to think about. Now, when we're going to find BC, we're still using the same reference angle, but when we look to solve for BC, this time BC, we're going to have to use adjacent and hypotenuse. So again, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the only thing that's going to change is our function cosine. So cosine 23 is adjacent BC. Oops, I made that mistake. See, if we were in class, somebody would have already yelled at me. I got carried away talking about hypotenuse. Moron. It's opposite and adjacent. So opposite and adjacent has to be tangent. So tangent 23. Now, I will say, as much as that's annoying to me, and I will be annoyed when I have to upload it, the reason I knew I was wrong was I put BC on top, went to put the length of the hypotenuse in, and in my original paper, there's no value. So I would have had to put BC over AC, and that's two unknowns. So as much as that was a mistake, that does show us that if you have two unknowns in your equation, you can't solve. So look for what is known and what is unknown. So opposite over adjacent, 14 over BC should be what we're using. So again, I had to change that because I didn't have enough information to use cosine. So now with tangent, opposite and adjacent, that's what I'm able to use. So then we have tangent 23. And again, that's our ratio, but it's in decimal form. And we're going to cross multiply again. And that gives us, again, I'm not writing these decimal places down for anything but visual work so that I keep track of what operation I'm using. Then I'm going to divide both sides. So 14 divided by our decimal, second answer. And we end up with the length of BC is about 32.98. And considering the length up, or the angle up here would have to be 67 degrees, it makes sense that it's going to be relatively close. So at least we're following our triangle inequality, where opposite the smallest angle should be our shortest side, opposite our largest angle should be our longest side, and that. So our equations aren't going to change just because we're doing side lengths. Our equations are going to stay the same when we switch over to angle measures. And if you remember from last year, the angle measures were actually a lot easier because everything was done in your calculator. And I'm using a special right triangle here, because 8, 15, 17, or not a special, a Pythagorean triple. 8, 15, 17, I should have memorized, and that will allow me a little bit easier, especially if you're told for some reason to solve the entire right triangle. You will need to make sure that you do find that side length. For now, the directions are simply going to be find the measure of angle Y and the measure of angle X. So again, doesn't really matter which one we start with, but I am going to start with angle Y first. So that is our reference angle because that's the one we're working with. And according to this reference angle, here's my opposite, the hypotenuse, and the adjacent side. And again, I want to choose my trig function according to the two known values. So my two known values are adjacent and hypotenuse. So again, the only one that has adjacent and hypotenuse grouped is cosine. So we're going to use cosine. This time, instead of a number, we have to put our angle in. It's the unknown. But adjacent over hypotenuse can be filled in. And when we talk about undoing operations, we know that we're using our inverse operations. So when you're asked to write the equation for how to solve for y, don't forget that our inverse cosine is that second operation above cosine. And what we do to one side of our equation, we have to do to the other to make sure that they do stay equal. So really, when we write it out, it would look like this. And if we wanted, for whatever reason, exact value, y, the equation would be written like that. So y would equal inverse cosine of 8 over 17. So in order to figure out what our angle measure is, we simply go to our calculator. Second cosine, so that you get the inverse one to pop up. And then again, with our fractions, don't use the ABC button. I find that that especially in Algebra 2 causes issues because you can't do radicals in the fraction, you can't do decimals in the fraction, and if we have all kinds of them mixed up in one triangle, it won't work. It'll keep giving you a syntax error. So with the division symbol, that at least prohibits any of those errors popping up. So 8 over 17, you don't even have to close the parentheses, just push enter, and that will tell you that your answer for that angle y is about 61.93 degrees because we have to round. And because these two angles are complements, meaning they add up to 90 degrees, I don't have to do any other work except to find the measure of angle X. We're going to take 90 minus the 61.93. And we end up with the measure of angle X is approximately 28.07 degrees. So if any of you are remembering last year, the finding angles were much faster. And for the majority of you, you just did it all in your calculator. You never even wrote out all these lines. You went from what it started with to the answer very quickly because it's all done in the calculator. Does anybody have any questions thus far? And I guess the next question would be, did anybody watch any of the geometry notes? All right, so what we're gonna do is finish up with angles of elevation and depression. So the good part is the trig is all the same. We're not going to have any issues with any of our trig work changing. What we have to remember is what happened with parallel lines. So when we talk about angles of elevation and angles of depression, what ends up happening is we have to kind of remember this Z shape from geometry, where when the lines are parallel, we have alternate interior angles. And what that tells me is if I'm up here looking down, and someone's down here looking up, and they make eye contact, the angle of elevation has to match the angle of depression. So looking up and looking down, they have to match. So it doesn't matter as long as we also keep in mind that these are line of sights. So ideally this guy, he's not floating above it, but it's eye level and eye level. So that was one of the things when we went outside last year and we were measuring the height of the stop sign or the height of the clock. And one or two people always come back with, I know the clock isn't 4 feet off the ground. They then comprehend that, well, the person measuring was over 6 foot tall. So you have to add in that height unless the problem specifies from the ground. So a lot of times you'll look at angles of elevation questions where it's a ladder. So obviously the ladder is touching the ground. So what we have to remember is that no matter what, angle of depression, angle of elevation, those angles have to match. So when we're looking at, and I'll just, to remind us, maybe do an example or two from even what we looked at last year. You always have, for whatever reason, there's always these people standing on cliffs looking at boats. All right, so we've got a person on a cliff looking down at a boat in Lake Erie. If the angle of depression is 37 degrees and the cliff is 24 feet high, how far out is the boat? Now, I want to make sure that when you do your answers, because there's nothing in here describing how tall the person is, there's nothing in here saying how far off the ground the person is, so there's no real specifics about the person. You are always to assume that this angle of depression is truly, the ground level of the cliff, so that 24 feet, when you're drawing your picture, matches what you believe should be. So if we're starting up here at our person, and we know that the cliff is 24 feet, so that's our cliff. And we know that this angle of depression, so now here's where we have to be careful. Don't forget that we have this line of sight that doesn't exist. All right. And the angle of depression here is 37 degrees. But when we're looking at where the boat is down here, notice how that angle falls outside of what will be our right triangle. So here's our boat, here's our person, here's just the ground where the cliff touches. So again, if that 37 degrees is there, the other 37 degrees has to be here. They have to match. So depending upon how you choose to do this, you can always take it from the vantage point of the angle of elevation. Again, they have to match. The line of sight has to match. You have your alternate interior angles because your parallel lines do exist. And if I wanted to know how far out the boat was, that's the value I'm looking for. So I'm going to do everything according to angle of elevation because it's now inside my triangle. Here is my opposite. Here is the adjacent. So we know we have to do tangent of 37 is opposite over adjacent. And I work with my calculator. And tangent 37, I'm going to just write a few down for the work, but I'm not taking it off of my calculator so I don't lose all the decimal places. So we have our decimal when we cross multiply, times x equals 24. So I'm going to take 24 divided by second answer. So I get all those decimal places cut and pasted back in. And we end up with x is 31.85 feet. So our boat is almost 32 feet away from the ground. Now, I could have, if I wanted to, I know in here, this whole thing should be 90 degrees. So if that's 37, this guy should be 53. And if that's the case, here's now my opposite. Here's now the adjacent. I'm still using tangent, but if I did tangent of 53 equals opposite over adjacent, so x over 24, tangent of 53 and when I cross multiply, I just have to do times 24. And you'll notice I obviously end up with the same answer. And that's because we had a different reference angle, but our side lengths aren't going to change. So because we were at a different vantage point, we were able to set up our work similarly, but our answers are identical. I have a tendency to always work with the reference, the elevation, because it always matches the depression. I don't have to worry about doing that extra step with the complement, and then I don't have to worry about mixing up what's opposite and adjacent. So that's why I always work with the angle of elevation. So today, that's it. You should have enough now to work with those worksheets. Again, I loaded those last week. Those are the last of the required homework. Again, you are going to have a Google quiz that I will assign later. I could assign it on the 22nd, but that would be the last day of any assigned work. So your last homework is the 2 worksheets. You will have a Google quiz on the trig information. Wednesday, we will come back, look at a couple examples, answer your questions, and then that'll be it for Wednesday. When we come back after Memorial Day, I will not meet with you on Tuesday because that is supposed to be for English, social studies, and electives, but we will be back Wednesday. So this week will be Wednesday, and then next Wednesday, and probably next Friday. That way we'll double up if need be. So just know that this is it for today. You will have a Google quiz by the end of the week. No new homework. Everything that I've already assigned, that's what you'll finish up with. But we will keep pushing forward, and anything that I give, it will only be practice. It will not be assigned work. I did make a note in Google Classroom that I did have 2 people email me and ask about the one no reassignment. And it was required. It was homework. In fact, I think it was the only homework I gave that week. I said 60% or 60% would get you the completion points, 10 points. However, if you ended up with an 80, above an 80%, so 80, 90, 100, whatever, you would get 5 extra credit points. So I know there are some of you who may not have done as well on the quizzes as you had hoped for. At least NoRe allows you the opportunity to get a walkthrough, see a different video, not the same video. So if you have questions, please email me, and we will take any questions you have on Wednesday. over the homework. So please make sure if you have them, you email me. And eventually we will look to have those uploaded or sent to my email for grading. Anybody have any questions? All right. If not, I will hopefully maybe talk to you again on Wednesday, and we'll go from there. Have a great day, guys. I know it's raining here, so you won't be outside doing too much today. But have a great day, and I will talk to you on Wednesday.